And welcome in, friends. It is another episode of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Hi there. I'm Chris Mack, your friendly host. You can catch me on 93.7 The Fan weekday mornings from 5:40 to 10 a.m. as a part of the Fan Morning Show. Catch me on weekends, Sunday mornings on the BetQL Network, talking about sports and sports gambling from all sorts of different angles. The primary passion, though, especially this time of year, the Pittsburgh Penguins. Can they get in? It is an uphill battle. I haven't brought myself to looking at like 538 or any of the Hockey Viz sites that I usually go to get a percentage chance on whether the Penguins make the playoffs or not as we sit here Monday afternoon. But I have a feeling it's probably less than 50%. And I understand why, if that's the case, because it is an uphill battle. Even if they win their final two games, and they should win both of those final two games. If they don't win their final two games, they don't deserve to get into the playoffs. Let's be clear about that. Tuesday, their home finale against the Chicago Blackhawks, a 7:30 Eastern faceoff. Thursday at Columbus against the worst team in the league, the Columbus Blue Jackets, that a 7 p.m. faceoff. They should win both of those. And if they do, okay, they'll finish with 94 points on the season. The question, is that enough to get ahead of and stay ahead of the Florida Panthers and New York Islanders, who each have 91 points and each have 2 games left as well, and each have the first tiebreaker advantage over the Pittsburgh Penguins, which is regulation victories. Florida with 36, New York with 35, the Penguins with just 31. So they cannot catch the Isles or the Cats in that category. So they've got to beat them in points. They can't tie them in points. Florida and New York can only secure 2 more points in the standings each, or either or one of them, and the Penguins have to win both of their final 2 games in order to get into the playoffs. That's the simple math. The unfortunate part of it is both the Islanders and the Panthers are going up against teams in different scenarios who may not have much to play for. Monday night, it's the Islanders visiting an Alex Ovechkin-less Capitals team that has been mailing it in down the stretch. The Florida Panthers host a locked-into-place Toronto Maple Leafs team who have known for the better part, it feels like, of 2.5 months that they'll be playing the Tampa Bay Lightning in the first round. That is now actually locked in. They will be playing the Tampa Bay Lightning in the first round with home ice advantage over Tampa. So Toronto, very little left to play for. Still trying to get comfortable around a new number 1 goaltender in Samsonov with Matt Murray out due to concussion issues. Still trying to get a couple guys some landmark points for the season, but I don't know if that's enough for Toronto to go out of their way to bust it against the Panthers on Monday night. So let's presume everything plays out over the course of Monday night and Tuesday night as we expect it to. And that would be a win for the Islanders in Washington, a win for the Panthers at home against the Leafs, and a win at home for the Penguins against the Blackhawks. Well, then you'll have the Pittsburgh Penguins still sitting there out of the playoff picture at 92 points, while the Panthers and Islanders would have 93. And it would come down to Wednesday and Thursday. Wednesday, the Islanders host the Canadiens at 7 o'clock. And the Canadiens can't really, because of the way the standings sit right now, do much to improve their odds of winning the Connor Bedard sweepstakes, the NHL draft lottery. They are maxed out at an 8.5% chance to win the lottery. But they can hurt their odds and decrease their chance by winning games and adding more points in the standings to the 68 they have with 2 games left, including Wednesday night's game on Long Island. So I can't imagine the Canadiens are going to be going out of their way to put up much of a fight against the Islanders. Let's assume the Islanders win that one. The Islanders would then have 95 points. The Penguins would be out of the running for that first wild card spot. Again, if everything went chalk, so to speak, through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night, which means it would come down to Thursday. It would come down to the Pens in Columbus, a 7 o'clock face-off, and the Florida Panthers hosting the Carolina Hurricanes, also a 7 o'clock face-off on Thursday night. There's a couple ways that can go. Carolina could have clinched the Metro Division by that point. They play Buffalo. I believe it is on Tuesday night. Let me just make sure I have the schedule correct. No, the Devils play Buffalo on Tuesday night, Chris. Get it straight. Carolina visits Ottawa on Monday night. If Carolina were to beat Ottawa, which wouldn't surprise anybody, on Monday night, and the red hot, I guess we could call them, Buffalo Sabres, who've won 6 out of their last 10 and 2 in a row, and the Sabres were able to beat New Jersey on Tuesday night, well, then all of a sudden, a lot more things get locked into place. Carolina gets locked into the 1 seed in the Metro. They clinch the division and maybe have nothing left to play for on Thursday against the Florida Panthers. That's no good because a Panthers win then would clinch the final Eastern Conference playoff spot in this chalk scenario that we're playing out. And in fact, it would only take a single point for the Panthers in that scenario. All they would have to do is get to overtime. The Penguins would also, of course, have to win against the Columbus Blue Jackets. So that's why I totally understand if all of the hashtag math brings it into less than a 50% chance for the Penguins to squeak into this final Eastern Conference playoff spot. But I also understand that things don't always go chalk in the NHL, as we know. As we've seen the Penguins in games against, maybe not the Red Wings this weekend, but a couple weeks ago, in games at home against the Canadiens and the Senators and the Sharks. Things don't always go chalk. Or maybe that is chalk and the Penguins really aren't a playoff team, and that's why they're in the position they are in right now. I'm going to do it. I'm going to look it up before I bring Tango in, Eric Tangradi, former Pittsburgh Penguin, and Scott Burnside, just a couple minutes off on the horizon as well. I'm going to look it up. 538.com, great statistical website, has the Penguins' percent chance to make the playoffs at, just as I guessed, right below 50%, 45%. Yikes. Panthers at 78%, Islanders at 76%. This is what happens when you don't win the games you are supposed to win, whether it's in late October in Vancouver or January, February, and March at home against Montreal and San Jose and Ottawa. You put yourself behind the 8 ball. You don't control your own destiny, and you've got to hope Florida and or New York slips up in their final 2 games and you win out. We'll ask Eric Tangradi about what he saw, what we all saw Saturday in Detroit, which was the big guns and the biggest gun seemingly deciding to throw this thing on his back all over again at a point when we had maybe started to question whether he was still capable of that, at least in the course of this season. Tango joins me next. Chris Mack with you right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. And welcome back in. It is another episode of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. I'm Chris Mack of 93.7 The Fan and The Fan Morning Show, joined a couple times every week by my man Eric Tangradi, former Penguin, veteran NHLer and AHLer, and head coach of the Shady Side Academy ice hockey team as well. And we're going to go in all those different directions. That's why I bring it all. Everything on the CV is up for grabs today, Tango, because it all applies to how we're going to talk about this team after a big win in Detroit on Saturday. When we got down to the final 3 games, Detroit, Chicago, and Columbus, everybody said, hey, you don't beat these 3 teams. You don't deserve to get into the playoffs. But now that the standings are set up as they are, not only do you not deserve to get into the playoffs, you quite literally will not get into the playoffs if you don't win these final 3. And when it came time to show up, I'd like to take some credit, you and I, for this, because we talked about Sid on Friday and how he only had 2 goals in his previous 15 games or whatever it was. And was it maybe catching up to him, playing all 82 this year, eating as many minutes as he was on a nightly basis? And then bang, he shows up in a big way in Detroit. Huge goal at the end of the first period with just a few seconds left, gets a second one later. And it feels like if there is a clutch gene, if it exists, if there's a little hidden strand of DNA somewhere in every human, this guy has got to have it, because when they needed him in that moment, Saturday afternoon in Detroit, he showed up huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's the intangible part of when we, like, you look and you start to level like greatness of players, right? We talk about Big Ben, and then you talk about like different sports. Not always is it like statistically based. sure, you got to have the numbers to be in that argument, but like, how do these guys play in the biggest games? Me on the other side as a coach with high school kids, I always say, like, where are my gamers at? I want to see who my gamers are, right? Not the kid who's going to score 3 goals and an 8-0 win, but the one who's going to show up when your back's against the line and things matter most. And that to me is why Sidney Crosby is the greatest of all time, because he's just consistently shown that he's a gamer and he's gone through adversity along the way. And you're absolutely right. You challenge that guy for 5 minutes and it's like, okay, not that he even listens to the media because I think he's very present in himself, but it's just like, oh, okay, sorry, Sid's back to being Sid.
Yeah, exactly. Gino gets one too late to kind of put the icing on things. What's your confidence level? I'll ask you to put it on a 0 to 10 scale. Your confidence level that these guys have the ability to will this team to a pair of victories in games 81 and 82, as weak as the opposition may be.
Yeah, if the question is strictly out of 10, can they win these games? I feel like I'm an 8 or a 9, but the perfect answer is almost a 5 out of 10 if they're going to make the playoffs, because it's a coin flip. They've eliminated the part where it's in their hands. It's their own fate. They need to take care of business and they need luck. And that's kind of a situation you really don't want to be in this time of year, but it is just the cards are dealt.
Yeah, I mean, I just, after our conversation on Friday about the way those three, Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, have had to carry this team, how they've had to do so much more, they've been counted on for so much more this year. It really did hit me, especially after Crosby and Malkin both scored, and Crosby the way he did on Saturday, that this is exactly the time of year. Now, it may end up being too little too late in their case, but this is exactly the time of year. It's April, the weather's turning nice. When they turn their games up, and they show up in the big moments just as they did on Saturday. So I could see them, I could honestly see them, Eric, even coming out slow against Chicago or Columbus on Tuesday or Thursday in either of those games, or hitting a lull in one or both of those games. And one of those guys having one of those monster shifts where it feels like they just take the game by the throat and do whatever is necessary.
Yeah, and I think from a fan's perspective, that's how we need to watch these games at this part of the season, is just like admiring greatness. Because I thought that's something that Gray touched on that was like Ray Ferraro last week that was incredible, was like the Penguins are in this weird phase where like 3 players can will them to be a playoff team. Obviously, they have some good complementary players. Gensel, those guys, don't want to discredit their ability, but watching 3 guys will them to be like a above average hockey team, and like, where does that set the team up for the future of like, we're just witnessing greatness in Pittsburgh, and we have these expectations that because you have these 3 guys carrying a team of 23, that they should be a Stanley Cup contender. And when you just look around the league, that's just not the total recipe right now. And I'm just admiring greatness watching these guys, which at their age, you could still use the word prime, but it's incredible.
Yeah, the fact that they're still doing it at this age, 35, 36, is impressive. But you mentioned, relying on those 3 to do it all, not realistic. So it sounds like some reinforcements may be on the way back for the Chicago game Tuesday, maybe even the Columbus game Thursday, or if there should be playoffs in their future. Marcus Pettersson wasn't in the regular rotation, but was at practice in a full contact jersey, full participant. And then Kulikov and Bonino were back at practice on Monday morning as well. So are those the guys that you're looking to get back into the lineup if you're really going to start to flesh this thing out? Are those the kind of reinforcements that can help will them to a little bit more beyond just winning these final 2 games should they get into the playoffs?
Yeah, veteran presence, more pedigree. Bonino strong in the faceoff circle. Defensive forward, can help strengthen the special teams. Kulikov presence physically, block shots. Pettersson is kind of someone that can, not to the Chris Letang extent, but can lug the mail a little bit. So these are guys that can only help. I just know that this time of year, coming back from injury, like, you almost wish you had 2-3 weeks before playoffs to kind of get thrown into the fire, because there's really no time to get caught back up to game speed, get acclimated. Like, it's playoff hockey. It's right now.
If you're on the other side coaching, like let's play this out. Let's say they win their final 2 and they're able to sneak in, and they got to go up against Boston or Carolina in the first round. We know how difficult it's going to be. But if you're looking at the Penguins blue line, and let's say Pettersson's healthy and back and Kulikov is healthy and back, and you're looking at pairings of probably Dumoulin and Letang, probably Pedersen and Petrie, and probably Kulikov and Ruda. Kulikov and Ruda are definitely physical. We know what they can do, but they might not be as fleet of foot. We've seen the limitations that Dumoulin has had at times this year, but he's playing with Letang. Almost how that relationship has flipped in a way over the years to where now Letang is the guy looking out for Dumoulin. And I would think that Pedersen and Petrie would be similar as well, and that Pedersen may be a little bit more stay-at-home as we've seen Petrie try to add more offense to his game down the stretch. If you're the opposition, though, where do you try to get your top line out? Who do you try to get your top line out against if those are the pairings?
Yeah, I mean, respectfully, if you're Boston, I don't even think you're concerned about pairings. I mean, they have 1A, 1B, 1C. I'd expect in a series like that, Boston to play some of the most hard-nosed hockey, run that, chip and chase like you wouldn't see, or like you've never seen. Like they have the ability to play a skill game, a physical game. That's just what makes them so great. But I think at that point, I think you can fight fire with fire if you're Boston. I think you feel pretty good against Bergeron's line going against Crosby, Letang, and Dumoulin, trying to get those guys. Let's see our best versus your best, because we feel confident that our depth is better than your depth. So that's the big concern for me when it comes to the Penguins is, one, maybe two-dimensional. From there, where else can you find the ability to kind of get an advantage in the hockey game?
The other part of this that's interesting to me is we start to talk about Bonino getting back in the lineup. Granlund hasn't really done anything to get booted from the lineup yet, at least in Sullivan's opinion. Drew O'Connor banged up now. He was practicing Monday, but in a non-contact jersey. This Alex Nylander cat, who I think has looked like he can have an impact on games, and he did have an impact Saturday afternoon, scored the first goal of the day, and then nearly had a second one later. Should he be getting more opportunity? Is this the kind of guy that you can insert late in the year, especially once the playoffs come? If you're especially if you're the Penguins and you're in a no one expects us to do anything in the playoffs kind of scenario, especially if you get Boston in the first round. In my opinion, anyway, that's the kind of guy I inject into the lineup and let him run around out there with Paling and try to make some things happen with their foot speed, with their skill on that third line. Should he be getting more of a chance?
Yeah, I think so. I think Paling's been great too. He's been kind of someone to me that's been very consistent using his speed and his size. But no, Nylander, you can't judge him off of what he was, because I think he's really starting to become more consistent. He has, coming into the league as he was drafted, was supposed to be a high-end talented forward. So the skills there, and I think now he's starting to learn he needs to be more consistent, and he has to play a different role if he wants to stick. So I think at this point, they have nothing to lose by inserting somebody like that into their bottom six because of the high-end skill, his goal-scoring ability, and now that he's starting to slowly round out his game a little bit.
When you're riding that shuttle back and forth, that yo-yo, man, how frustrating is it? I mean, he's been some days, an emergency call up in the morning and shipped back to Scranton, even if it's just on paper, shipped back to Scranton in the afternoon. How hard is it riding that up and down NHL, AHL yo-yo?
Yeah, that is something I can confidently speak on, because that was probably pretty much my entire career. It's brutal. I mean, you can do it early on in your career because you still have the adrenaline and the goosebumps of playing in the NHL that you get. Not that, you take any opportunity for granted, but,
Right.
When you're in your mid to late 20s and you're, you feel like you're not being set up to have success. And what does that mean? Like most players get a pregame nap and a good meal. He's probably in a car coming across, I-80, 81 to get here. So it gets very frustrating and it's taxing mentally. But at the same time, like any other experience we go through as professionals, you have to be professional and you just have to find a way and not have excuses. So I think that's probably, after you do it 10, 15 times, you just learn to, you just take a deep breath and just say, it is what it is. And I just got to deal with it. Control what you can control.
All right, $1 million question. Tuesday, Chicago, Thursday, Columbus at the same time. Monday night, the Islanders have an Ovechkin-less Capitals team. The Panthers have a locked-in Toronto Maple Leafs team. They know they're going to be second in the Atlantic, and they're locked in to face Tampa. Wednesday, Islanders play Montreal, who wins for them reduce their chance of, granted a limited chance, 8.5% right now, but reduce their chance of possibly winning the Connor Bedard lottery. Thursday, Florida plays Carolina, who could have already clinched the Metro by then. It would seem that even if the Pens win their final two, there's still a good chance they don't make it because, like you said earlier, they don't control their own destiny. I know you threw out 50-50 earlier, but what's your gut feeling on how these final few days play out?
Yeah, looking back weeks ago, strength of schedule played a factor, but everything you said makes this it's just who's going to be ready to play. I mean, teams are going to start resting guys. I'd say if you look at the schedule, it's probably completely balanced. You just have three absolutely hungry hockey teams. The only difference is Florida's rolling right now, feeling pretty good. The Islanders are rolling. Um, honestly, three teams for two spots. It's going to take, I'll say, 4 or 5 out of 10, even if they win both games. It's just hard for me at this point, being even 1 point behind. And I don't know how the tiebreaker completely matches up right now. I don't think it looks good with the regulation wins for the Pens. So it's a long shot. But as we've always said, this team, these players, this pedigree, they seem to always find a way. But hopefully they can just stay present and understanding it's one day at a time at this point.
Real quick, before I let you run, two with Tango, you are coaching now. You're coaching high school kids at Shadyside Academy. And I got to think as a coach, it does your heart good to see a national championship won on a set play off of a face-off like Quinnipiac did it this weekend in the Frozen Four. It was textbook. It was like it was just drawn up on the dry erase board on the bench. And they said they practiced that thing hundreds of times this year throughout the course of the season. Does that warm the cockles of Eric Tangradi's coaching heart when he sees that? Or do you wish for more of the beautiful game where it's like, no, we want to see it happen off the rush. We want to see, a set play like that, you got to be feeling good as a coach.
Absolutely. And they've probably tried to run that play probably close to 100 times this season and maybe executed it twice because everything just has to be completely perfect. Win the draw. Okay, get it to your D partner. Then the winger has to time it perfectly. Stay on sides. Tape-to-tape execution. Like, it was beautiful to watch. And I'm sure they said the assistant coach was the one who drew that one up before the period. Like, I'm sure they haven't stopped him from smiling for the last 48 hours. But no, it was beautiful to watch. And we do face-off plays every day with the hope that we can get one extra scoring chance a game. If you execute it perfectly, you will get one extra scoring chance. So for a player's mindset, like, you do it in practice and you're like, okay, is it ever going to happen? Is it going to happen? And then boom, it's just awesome to see from players to coaches that all that work, all that execution pays off in the biggest moment. And what a game down the stretch. Like the last 10 minutes, they deserve to win the game just because the ice was tilted from the 10-minute mark on in Quinnipiac's favor.
So is this going to be, are we going to see the Shadyside Academy Bulldogs pull this out now in the fall once things get going? Or is there going to, if we hear you call out, what's Quinnipiac's mascot, the Bobcat? If we hear Coach yell out Bobcat, is that going to be the Quinnipiac play from here on out?
Yeah, we might as well try it, right? It's the positive of all this is all the press in hockey, it seems like, is like who can do the Michigan and do an individual skilled move. And that's the cool thing to do. So you see kids in practice doing that. So now as a coach to be able to pull some video and say, this is why we work on these plays. And this is why you guys think this is boring. And like, this is a national championship game and they execute and they score. So it's nice to have a little bit of backing to the words you're speaking to these kids on these boring neutral zone face-off plays. But we'll try it. You bet it. We'll try it.
Love it. Tango, thanks for the time today, man. We'll talk again later in the week, and we'll see what the scenario looks like. We could still be talking about percentage chances and who wins what and how many points need to be secured going into Thursday's game, and we'll definitely have plenty to break down off of Tuesday's game against Chicago as well, the home finale this year. Appreciate the time, man.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Great stuff as always from Tango. Yeah, you're going to hear him. He's going to be, if you're at a PIHL rink this fall, this winter coming up, you're going to hear somebody from Shadyside yell, Bobcat. They're going to run the Quinnipiac play off the face-off. He's right, though. When he says, 4 or 5 out of 10 is his confidence level in this team being able to get in now, I gave you the scenario. It's not sounding good. They can beat Chicago and Columbus both, get those 4 points, and it still might not be enough. As I outlined, Monday night, Islanders and Panthers both playing against teams without much left to play for. Wednesday, the Islanders play a Montreal team that would probably, all things considered, rather lose. Thursday, Florida against a Carolina team that might have nothing left to play for at that point. The other side of the coin is they may still be battling Jersey for the Metro Division crown on Thursday night. You keep your fingers crossed and hope that that's the case and that that's the scenario. All right, as we look ahead to how things play out in the final week of the season and then where they go from there, we'll ask Scott Burnside of Burnside on Hockey, NHL Insider, that same $1 million question. Do the Pens get in? The great Scott Burnside, next, right here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Chris Mack of 93.7 The Fan here with another edition of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Lucky enough to be joined by great NHL insider Scott Burnside. Check him out. Google Burnside on Hockey. That's where you find him, at Overtime Scott B on Twitter as well. And I'm going to dive right into it, Scott, because after probably what I imagined for some of us was a nice, relaxing, long holiday weekend, this is it's like one of those green-white checkered finishes in NASCAR. Everyone's going to slam on the gas and get to the finish and try to figure out where the chips are going to fall. And in the Penguins' case, it could be winning both of their final two games and still not getting into the playoffs. So I'll ask you right off the hop, when you look at the way things shake out for the Islanders, the Panthers, and the Penguins, 3 teams, 2 spots to get in as the Eastern Conference wildcards, what's your feeling on how things play out this week?
Yeah, Chris, you're absolutely right. And it doesn't, on some levels, it doesn't look great for the Penguins. And really, who do you have to blame if you're the Penguins for being in this position with 2 games to go, other than yourselves, right? I mean, this is a team brought back the core. The expectations, certainly were that they would be somewhere comfortably in the playoff mix in the Eastern Conference. And of course, that's not the case. They're going to need help. And listen, if you can't beat Chicago or Columbus in those final 2 games, well, shame on you. You don't deserve to be in the playoffs anyway. But let's assume that they take care of business. And, I think the last couple of games have been a good barometer for that. Sidney Crosby, once again, as he has for so many years, leading the way. So, I think the Penguins should win those final 2 games. So to your question, I think there's a way. Right now, they can't just get a point. You've got to clear either the Islanders or the Panthers because of the regulation win tiebreaker. So you can't be tied. But I think it happens. I just do. And I think there's so much uncertainty and unpredictability about the NHL game. It's part of what we love about it. And I'm curious to see what happens with the Florida Panthers. I assume Alex Lyon's going again for the Panthers. Journeyman netminder, been on an absolute rainbow. What a great story. Really has saved the Panthers season.
Mm-hmm.
But is there an end point to that? And your point about Toronto and Carolina, the second team that the Panthers will play this week, Toronto's sort of, my sense of Sheldon Keefe, I know I saw Ilya Samsonov was quoted as saying he'd like to play, wants to be in a groove in goal for the Leafs when they face Tampa next week in the playoffs.
Right.
Mitch Marner has a shot at 100 points. This is I know that they don't have anything to play for standings wise. I think this is a real test for the Florida Panthers because I think Toronto really, it's a team that hasn't won a playoff series since 2004. I don't think there's any coast in that team. Now, I haven't seen anything about their lineup. Are they resting guys? My sense is that this Leafs team is going to be a handful for Florida tonight. And so maybe this is the best shot for the Penguins, even though they're not playing, to make up that ground, right? So a regulation loss, which is critical, I think that that's a possibility. And then Carolina is interesting too, because, and I provide some content for Carolina. So, and it's a Canes team still fighting for first place in the Metropolitan Division. A team, I think a lot of questions surrounding them heading into the playoffs. No Andrei Svechnikov, of course, Max Pacioretty, done long-term weeks and weeks ago. The goaltending a little bit in a state of flux, with Frederik Andersen hasn't played in the playoffs. This will be his first start in 3 years, assuming he gets to start in game 1. So I think this is a Carolina team, again, in game 82 in South Florida. I don't, and just understanding how Rod Brindamore and his coaching staff approach things, I
Right.
don't think there's any coast in that Carolina team, too. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a chance that Florida loses at least one of these final two games. You have to hope if you're a Penguins fan, it's in regulation. The Islanders are a different story. They're going to, Washington is no Ovechkin, as you mentioned, and that Caps
Right.
team is just, man, they are playing out the string. So,
Yeah.
the Islanders look to me to be a team that has an easier way to stay ahead of Pittsburgh over these final few games. But I think there's, I just think, and Florida has shown us incredible wobbles throughout this regular season. So I don't know. That's why you play them, though, right? Who knows?
Exactly.
You and I'll talk tomorrow.
Well,
Caps will win tonight 5-0, and then it'll all
blow
be
the whole
frozen.
thing up. Yeah. I like your point. I can get behind your points in regards to both of those teams that Florida is going to play this final week, in that, Carolina could still be fighting for things. They've got an Ottawa team that's been scrappy down the stretch. And so there's no guarantees on that stacking up points for them. And if Jersey were to win Tuesday night against Buffalo, and again, Buffalo's been playing well down the stretch as well, but Jersey's still looking to chase Carolina down for that Metro Division crown. Well, all of a sudden, Carolina's trying to scrap and fight and claw for points as well on Thursday. And with the Leafs on tonight, Monday night, you make a great point. Marner chasing 100 points, and I think even greater so in Samsonov trying to get primed for the playoffs with Matt Murray being out. Who knows what the situation is like there, but if they know they're going to ride him and he's the guy at this point, then he's going to want to be tuned up and he's going to want to feel locked in going into the playoffs. So that's a great point. Speaking of locked in going into the playoffs, the Bruins, they tie Tampa and Detroit for the wins record over the weekend. But I noticed, and maybe this is just wishful thinking on the part of a fan of a team who may play them in the first round. Neither one of those two teams won the cup. The 17 Lightning went out in the first round, in fact, and the Red Wings didn't even get to the cup final. They lost in the Western Conference final. So are the Bruins, in your opinion, more 17 Tampa, 96 Detroit, or are they maybe more a team that I haven't heard them compared to as much and who they still may catch for the overall points record, 77 Canadiens, who lost just 2 games in the playoffs and just steamrolled everyone?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, and again, maybe it's recency bias, but I am wondering about Boston and the playoffs and how they respond to when adversity really finally strikes them, right? I mean, and on listen, Linus Ullmark, he wouldn't be my Vezina guy just because his workload's been a little bit lesser than a Sorokin or a Hellebuck but listen, Linus Ullmark has been a revelation. Boston gives up so little. They kill you every way you want to be killed. There's Pasternak with a hat trick on Easter Sunday to get to 60 goals. There is nothing not to like about that Boston team. And there's really nothing to suggest that, a team like Pittsburgh or Florida, although Florida's kind of a weird team because they can sure light it up when they get the opportunity. It's hard to imagine that they could fall into the trap that Tampa fell into in being swept by Columbus back in 2018. So 18 or 19, 18. And I guess my thinking is what happens to the Bruins when they play, and let's move them to the second round. They're going to play either Tampa or Toronto, 2 good teams, although Tampa has looked a little bit bored by the whole process the last month or so, but those are 2 real good teams. That goes without saying. How do they respond to that? And I go back to that Tampa team that won 62 games. I remember having a conversation after the fact with head coach John Cooper, and he was like, we had nothing to play for so long. We had no urgency. Bruins going for the record. That's not real urgency, right? That it is what it is. It's not anything compared to if you get down 2-0 in a playoff series or you face your first elimination game. Those are completely different things. And Tampa had no answer for that. And Columbus dug in and they never quit. So I'm not saying the same thing can happen. You know, Patrice Bergeron, first ballot Hall of Famer, whenever he decides that he's going to quit. Brad Marchand, really, I think, is probably Hall of Fame bound at some point. You know, Pasternak is having just an incredible season. So, you know, I'm not saying they can't be beat because, as you point out, history tells you that winning the President's Trophy more often than not means you don't win the Stanley Cup.
Right.
But I am curious to see how the Bruins respond to adversity when it comes, because it will come, and how they respond to having to elevate that urgency when they need to, because they have had very little to play for literally weeks and weeks.
So let's bring it back to the Penguins, and let's assume they face the Bruins. Still an outside shot, although it's limited, outside shot that they could face Carolina or New Jersey in the first round. Are Crosby, Malkin, and Letang enough to upset any of those teams without the elite goaltending that we have yet to see the Penguins get this season?
Yeah, no, I think the simple answer is no. But again, it's been so hard to I think to synthesize what this Penguins team is about or what they're capable of the last 2 or 3 years in the playoffs, because of course the injuries last year. You know, to me, they were the better team in that series against the New York Rangers, even with a third string goaltender going to overtime in Game 7. Right? I mean, if I know it's a mug's game to say they're the better team, though, than the New York Rangers through 7 games. And if they get the goaltending, they win that series. And I think the same was true 2 years ago against the Islanders, right? Tristan Jarry wasn't good enough. And Tristan Jarry needs to be real good the next couple of nights if he's going to play both those games. And I assume he's going to be the guy in Game 1 if they do get in. And we have seen at various points of time that he is an elite NHL netminder. I mean, went to an all-star game. It just has been so inconsistent, and never knowing when that moment is going to be at hand. You can't win that way. It's the ultimate truism in hockey. If you don't have the ultimate confidence in your goaltender at the drop of the puck every single night, it's very, very difficult to win. You know, Colorado was a bit of an aberration last year. Didn't really matter who was in net for them. Darcy Kuemper was okay, got hurt, was okay. Pavel Francouz, it didn't really matter to them, but you can't count on that. And certainly if you're going to upset, or if you're even just going to go toe-to-toe with a juggernaut like the Boston Bruins, you are absolutely going to have a netminder who steals a game or 2 games. I think of that first game against the Rangers a year ago, Casey DeSmith, who was unbelievable, then gets hurt, and that's an unbelievable game. And the Penguins, they found a way to win that game, and they're going to need either Tristan Jarry or Casey DeSmith to find that kind of level of play in order to steal 2, maybe 3 games if you're going to stay close. And ultimately, if you are going to knock off the Boston Bruins. But I will say this only. Listen, never count out that core. And I know it's been a long playoff dry spell. If there's not urgency within that core, if they make it to the playoffs, if there's not urgency from that group now, I mean, when will it arrive? Right? It's been a long time for success for players who are used to, for a long time in their career, having success on a regular basis. So I hope it happens. I think it's great drama. I think it would be great theater. And certainly I know, the ownership must be like, this is why we brought them back, right? Didn't bring them back to wonder about our draft position here, what's going to happen the second week of April. They're counting on playoff games. So
the stated goal is fairly straightforward. If those 3 are at the core of things, you're absolutely right. So what does the offseason look like? And this is not just, it is a Penguin-centric question because we've talked about Jarry and DeSmith, but can any team fix their goaltending issues? Can the Penguins fix their goaltending issues if they believe they exist this offseason? Because I see a lot of second-tier guys, and I don't see anybody who necessarily jumps out, especially free agency-wise, as a possible replacement for Tristan Jarry.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there was this idea. I mean, in a perfect world, do you draft and develop your goaltending. That's what happens. It comes from within, all those kinds of things. But it really, it doesn't happen all that often, right? I mean, yes, Sorokin with the Islanders, Vasilevsky, obviously, with Tampa, Shesterkin in New York, but there are lots of Stanley Cup teams that bring in their goaltending, right? I mean, you can do it both ways. You just have to make the right decision. And so, where do you find the goaltending if you're going to the marketplace to find it? Now, that's
right.
That's the real question, right? I mean, Freddie Anderson's going to be UFA. He hasn't played in the playoffs in a couple of years. So what does he show for Carolina? What happens there? There isn't an obvious answer. And you're absolutely right, Chris. But maybe it's not the obvious answer. I think of a kid like Philip Gustafson in Minnesota, whose numbers are among the top in the NHL since the midpoint of the season, since January, whatever the timeline is. His numbers are among the best in the NHL. And basically, he comes back in a deal for Max Talbot with Ottawa. And I've talked to a couple of goaltending experts. They're like, did not see that coming. So, what's your scouting department like? What's your pro staff say? There is this guy, Billy Husso, has been really good in Detroit. Different example because they're not a playoff team. But can you find that player that comes into that position and doesn't just get you the playoffs in the spring of 24, but maybe becomes a player around whom you can build your playoff team for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years? That's the question. And there probably are going to be half a dozen NHL teams scouring the landscape, looking for exactly that kind of player to play goal for them next year, whether it's Toronto or Carolina or whoever it's going to be. That's where you have to trust your staff and go with what you believe can happen. I don't see any way you could come back to the same goaltending situation that you had this year in Pittsburgh, but who knows? What happens if they knock off Boston in the first round? You and I are having a completely different conversation about what the offseason looks like
all bets
for this
are off.
team vis-a-vis the goaltending.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you get a sense that, and I find it hard to read from the back channels available to me, but do you get a sense that John Gibson is maybe any less interested in sticking around in Anaheim for the rebuild there? Because he is now a guy he's been in his prime years, but a guy who I don't know. It's hard to get a sense from talking to people whether he has the appetite for sticking around in Anaheim while that process plays out.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm just looking up John Gibson's contract status as we see here. Now, he does have, according to my trusty cap friendly, he has a modified no trade clause. He has a 10-team no trade list. Have to believe, given his connection to the Pittsburgh area, that he would love to be a Penguin, but I don't know that for sure. Under contract through 26-27 at $6.4 million. It's not a bad number. I think, though, you have to wonder, has he been beaten down? Basically, has he been broken by playing for one of the worst teams in the NHL over the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, there was a period of time when people considered him one of the top young goaltenders in the game. I don't know if that's the case. And to go back to my point, you have to, if that's the kind of deal you're thinking about, to me, you can't be giving up assets, prime assets for John Gibson. This has to be where Anaheim and John Gibson are saying, let's agree to move on here. And where Anaheim is moving salary and moving into a different phase of their evolution as a team. Like, to me, though, you can't be considering John Gibson and sending out top end assets, whether that's picks or prospects, and then let's be honest, Penguins don't have a huge reservoir of high end prospects, even though they don't have a lot of room on their roster given their salary structure. So, I'm not against John Gibson. I just don't know what you're going to get with him. And go back to my point, you better be pretty darn sure that he is exactly what you want for a guy that's under contract through 26-27. That's
Right.
You can't make that mistake. If he's not any better than Tristan Jarry or Casey DeSmith, then that makes no sense.
Then what did you do it for exactly? It's mandatory in Pittsburgh that we ask about John Gibson when we talk goaltender issues.
I totally get it. And you know what? And maybe, I do believe in the fresh, scene is really helpful. It's truly helpful for some players. And listen, that's a hard place, right? Changing, it's top problems at the top, and that's a hard place. That's not a very good team. And so maybe going somewhere else, you find your groove or your karma again. And we do know that he, certainly had the tools. Does he still have them? Again, that's where you have to trust your scouting and just have to trust what you believe organizationally, if he's the right guy to fill that void.
Last thing before I let you run. Who's going to do the fixing this offseason? Does a playoff berth, if the Penguins secure one, buy Ron Hextall another year? And when, if at all, especially in the landscape of the NHL, where we know head coaches get shuffled in and out so easily and so quickly, when does Mike Sullivan's seat get hot, if at all? Would missing the playoffs reverberate back onto him at all?
Yeah, I think when you don't make the playoffs and you have the core that the Penguins have, then everyone should be uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. I do go back, I think Ron Hextall is one of the smartest guys in the game. I really do. I think he's a great hockey mind. That situation in Pittsburgh is different than I think any other situation in the game. And if you went back and talked to Jim Rutherford and Ray Shero beforehand, it just is. You got that core, and when ownership, the directive from ownership is, hey, we want those guys back, and so make that happen. Well, then you do that, and part of the reason is you don't have 5 or 6 guys that are coming up through Wilkes-Barre ready to charge into the lineup, which is what happened back in right. 07, 08, 09, and so on, because you're in the playoffs every year. So you don't get right. those guys, and you're trading assets every single year pretty much to try and load up for yet another run. And why wouldn't you do it that way when you have, I would say this, the greatest player of his generation in Sidney Crosby, and you have a Hall of Famer in Evgeny Malkin, and maybe a Hall of Famer in Chris Letang? All right, load up and do it every year. But you're right. Like at some point, the well's going to run dry, and it may run dry in 2 or 3 days. And then that's the question. Well, so what do you do? And I think it's, listen, Mike Sullivan's earned all kinds of leash and rope. Yeah. And to me, it's about having a candid discussion. What do you want? What do you want to do? Because we have to make some changes here. And boy, it's hard, because the way that team is built right now, it's hard to make, dramatic, systemic changes to that roster. Like, you can't just get young by snapping your fingers. It's going to be hard. And some of the moves have not panned out for Ron Hextall, but his mandate has been build a team, go as far as you can. And if you don't make the playoffs, well, is that Ron Hextall's fault? Well, he shares the burden for that, just as Mike Sullivan does. But I don't know. At some point, ownership has to, well, okay, maybe. So what do we do now? Like, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we should have done something different a year ago. It's easy to ask that question when you're sitting 1 point out of a playoff spot with 2 games to go. And that may be moot if they make the playoffs and have a good, strong series against Boston or Carolina. Who knows? Maybe you change your mind about how all of this looks. So pretty premature, I think, this is what should happen, because it's still very fluid.
Scott, great stuff as always. Always appreciate your insight. People can check you out on Twitter. Overtime Scott B is the Twitter handle, at Overtime Scott B. And of course, Burnside on hockey. People can go there and get the latest from you on a daily basis as well. Great NHL insider, Scott Burnside, here on Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Thanks again for the time.
Anytime, Chris.
That's something to hear Scott Burnside, who's one of the guys plugged in really well around the league, say that Ron Hextall is one of the better hockey minds in the game. He's not saying that if he doesn't hear other people around the league saying it. That's what's wild. We have insulated ourselves to a point here. And look, I'm not willing to absolve Ron Hextall of what I think is an awful roster building job. this past offseason, this past year, this past 2.5 years. Yes, we'll go all the way back to what should now just be known as the Jared McCann incident, leaving McCann and Tanev available for the Kraken to claim, and both have been key to that team making a run this year. And who knows how deep the Kraken go to the playoffs with McCann as a possible 40-goal scorer. But again, that means people around the league who, again, Scott talks to a ton of people around the NHL. People around the league are looking at Hextall and saying, he might be getting a raw deal there in Pittsburgh. He's actually a pretty smart guy. And whether you agree with it or not, and I think a lot of us disagree with that opinion, right? Whether you agree with it or not, other people are out there thinking that, which is wild. But I don't know. That might give you some sense of if the Penguins are able to wrangle a playoff berth out of the final 4 or 5 days of this season and put up at least a respectable fight against whoever their first round opponent may be, that's probably enough to keep Ron Hextall in his gig. That's just wild to me because it doesn't help them going into this offseason build and prepare anymore for the final few years of the Crosby, Malkin, Letang era. If you haven't already, do yourself a favor. My gosh, if you're in your Odyssey app listening to this right now, AUDACY, go up into the upper right-hand corner if you haven't already. Tap follow, and then you'll get notified as soon as new episodes of Fifth Avenue Faceoff are available to you. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you. Hello, how are you? Be sure to subscribe. Click the little notification button as well on the 93.7 The Fan YouTube page, and you'll get notified as soon as new episodes are available of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Wherever you get your podcast, please subscribe, favorite, download, rate, review, all that stuff. Let us know exactly how we're doing. You can always give feedback as well at the Chris Mack on Twitter. You can go there. Let me know what you think of Fifth Avenue Faceoff. Thanks again to Scott Burnside. Thanks to Eric Tangradi. We will see how things go Tuesday in the home finale against the Blackhawks and be back on Wednesday to talk about it. And what remaining playoff chances there are. Who knows? Again, based on what happens Monday night for the Islanders and Panthers, the Penguins may have a shot to leap right back into playoff position on Tuesday against the Chicago Blackhawks. Or they may be going into that game 3 points down with just 2 games left to play. That's some nightmare fuel for you as a Penguins fan, but we'll talk about it however it shakes out in the next 24 to 48 hours. We'll do it again on Wednesday. The next edition, Derek Scully of Robert Morris, by the way, will join me, as well as Eric Tangradi as well, of Fifth Avenue Faceoff.